You're listening to One Free Family, a new take on peaceful parenting, where you can hear ideas for helping to raise free, independent, and peaceful children. Visit onefreefamily.com to connect and listen. Here are your hosts, James and Taylor Davis.
Hi there, this is James.
And this is Taylor.
And this is our first ever recording of our new One Free Family podcast. Are you excited?
Really excited.
Me too. Well, so we talked a lot about what the format of this podcast will take over time. And we have a lot of ideas and a lot of really exciting things that we hope to share about, research that we've been running up against in terms of parenting our kids more peacefully and more effectively. Little things going on in our lives, little topics that come up on a day-to-day basis when you have 3 kids at home with you all day and you split time. So both of us get the benefit of being able to be with them a lot. And I think we're really excited to get to all of that stuff, but we were talking and we kind of feel like it might be a good place to start just to talk about kind of our origin story with all of this. Where did we first come up with the idea internally? I mean, we didn't invent a lot of these ideas, but where did we first decide to kind of parent our kids in a radically different way than a lot of people? So yeah, this podcast will be primarily about that story and sharing kind of how we arrived here, why we arrived here, and what our goals are in terms of both our parenting and of this podcast.
Yeah, and I think it's also helpful to hear people's stories about how they came to where they are in terms of their parenting and their family culture, because I think a lot of people want to make a change in their lives and it feels really overwhelming, but hearing other people's stories, you can start to see that it's really just, change one small thing at a time, and before you know it, you've kind of overhauled your whole family culture. And we're still a work in progress too, but we just keep trying to make a better choice every day. And so I think hearing our story, it can be helpful for people who are kind of moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's really tempting to try to label yourself or to create a binary, right? Like, for instance, around the term unschooling, which is a term I think we largely identify with. You'll find this trap that I think people walk into where they're either a purist unschooler where they do everything radically and their kids can brush their teeth or not or whatever. And this gradient of, well, we try to give our kids as much freedom as we can while still helping things to feel comfortable and safe for us and, maybe be a work in progress or have a moving target as to how you want to parent in the future. But none of this is right or wrong stuff. What we're hoping to talk about is just our approach, what feels comfortable for us right now. And, we think it's evidence-based and hopefully a good fit for a lot of different people, but we're not trying to come and say, these are the only ways to parent and this is the way you should do it or you're a bad person.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So why don't you get us started? I mean, this is a long journey, right? So we, just so you guys have a little bit of background history, both Taylor and I were certified to be school teachers in college. That was what we went to college for. Me for secondary education and English, and Taylor for elementary ed and psychology. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So to go from that to, being very much entrenched in the traditional educational paradigm, learning all that to where we are now, which I guess we haven't even described yet, a very, very self-directed approach to helping our kids to interact with the world. How does that all get started?
Sure. So James is right. It started quite a while ago. After our first child was born, our oldest is 7.5 now. So that's kind of when we started this path. I was teaching in an elementary school. It was a private elementary school. And at this time, when we started kind of diving into this rabbit hole of changing the way that we had planned to raise our kids, our son was between 6 and 12 months old.
Yeah.
He wasn't yet a year. And so the thing that kind of really jump-started it all for us was I had an in-service training at my work one day. We had no students at the school, and it was an in-service, and we had this expert come in to basically teach us how to be more creative and differentiate our instruction to the different needs in our classroom. And so he came in with this really awesome, compelling presentation. And one thing that he showed us was the Sir Ken Robinson video, which is called Schools Kill Creativity. Is that the one?
Yeah.
Yep. He has a few really good ones. And hopefully they'll be linked. We can link to them.
Yeah. Roger, if you're listening. Thanks to Roger, by the way, for helping us get this podcast launched. But yeah, Schools Kill Creativity, and it was the RSA animate video. So it's like a graphically recorded drawing video.
So it's him, delivering this presentation with these graphic, drawings overlaid. And it was so compelling all about just how schools kill creativity and, all about the history of education and how, our education system is still functioning the way it was functioning when it was created, back in the Industrial Revolution. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I came home and I told James about it right away, and I pulled it up and I was like, you have to watch this. And how ironic is it that they showed this to us at the school that I'm teaching at, because at the same time that they're trying to get us to do this, they've also handed me a prepackaged math curriculum and told me, this is what you have to teach. You still need to differentiate, but like you have to follow this every day. So that kind of got the wheels turning for us. And James watched that video. And before we knew it, we were just down this rabbit hole of learning about self-directed education.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of crazy to think about too, because I remember prior to you coming home with that, I remember we would have these long, earnest discussions about like public or private school, for instance. We had all these theories about how our kid could kind of turn out. Well, should we send him to a private school where he'll get more attention, or should we send him to a public school where it'll maybe be a little tougher? But hey, we both went to public school and we turned out okay, right? And there were all these aspects of growing up in public school, especially in New Jersey, that we really valued, right? Meeting people from all different backgrounds and, kind of being in the so-called real world pretty quickly, facing that kind of adversity. We really valued that. But so it became a pretty radical shift. I mean, we watched the RSA animate video, and then you start asking yourself questions like, do we want to put our kids through something really difficult on purpose just for the sake of toughening them up, or might there be another way, right? And I think it was around that time too that we saw the documentary SurfWise. You remember that? Yeah, that was really funny. So SurfWise is a crazy documentary, and these people seem fully nuts when you first watch it, if you're not aware of the kind of the paradigms of self-directed learning. But these people were they just basically threw away everything they have. I think the guy was a doctor. It's been, I don't know, 7 years since we watched this, so I don't remember all the details. But so he was a doctor, and they just threw away their conventional life to drive around surfing and letting their kids do whatever, right? And it seemed really crazy at the time. And, there are aspects of the way they parented their kids that we haven't adopted or anything. But I think it really spoke to us mostly because it was like, wow, there are just other ways to do it.
Right.
Like we had never actually thought critically, I don't think, about doing anything besides exactly what everyone does, right? Which is just find some school or another to send your kid to and hope that it works out. And maybe you think about which school to send your kids to, but even like homeschooling, like we knew one family, I think, that homeschooled. And I remember we were like, who homeschools? Like, that's like the craziest thing we ever heard, right? So yeah, it was a pretty radical shift. So talk then about, so we heard these ideas. There are other options besides homeschooling, right? Why did we ultimately move in that direction?
Yeah, I think, why did we move in that direction? I think it just became more and more clear to us, not only the educational side of all of this and the self-directed education that we really believe in, but I think, this inevitably has, meshed into our parenting and our family culture so much as well. And so I think the more that we kept reading and the more that we kept learning, from there, we were just like hungry for this information. So I just kept finding, new blogs online about people who were living an alternative lifestyle and who were keeping their kids home from school. And I think that staying out of schools and keeping our kids home and also in the real world, they go places with us all the time, to us was appealing because we could give them the freedom that we were starting to see we wanted to be able to give them to spend their time the way that they chose.
Yeah, and I think we also were looking at that it would be a truly individualized education, right? One of the things that educational theorists always talk about is trying to create as individualized an experience as possible. Well, what better way to do that than to just do it, right? And, we were in a position financially where we were lucky enough to be able to make it work, to be a single income family. But that was tricky too. I mean, at the time, I was playing poker professionally, and that was becoming more and more difficult with the legislative environment in the US. And so we actually made a pretty big life change to try and, accommodate being a single income family more directly. We found a summer camp in upstate New York and decided that we could, if they hired us, we would move up there, have you be home with the kids to start, and I would be working, but our housing and even food for part of the year would be taken care of. But that was another, we moved up there for a number of reasons, but I think one of the objections we hear all the time is, it's hard to make it work, or how do you sort this out financially? But we decided that it was so important to us that we would make a pretty big, huge change in our life, move 6 hours away from where we had been living to sort of the middle of nowhere, as far as everyone where we were from is concerned. If you're listening in central New York, we don't think it's the middle of nowhere now. We miss you guys and really valued our time there quite a bit. But it was a huge life change. And I think at that same time, we were getting so motivated by these ideas that we actually even talked about perhaps starting our own school, when you really adopt or really internalize this idea that learning should be self-directed, it starts to light a fire under me anyway.
Yeah.
It starts to really help you question, like, again, both of us went to school to learn how to teach, to learn about the best ways to educate kids. And the idea of self-direction, at least in my curriculum, never came up.
Not once for me.
Right. It wasn't like there was some professor who was up there and they were talking about the different approaches to education. And they said, and some people believe in self-directed education, but here's why that doesn't work.
It wasn't even mentioned.
No, it wasn't even mentioned. And I don't want to be conspiratorial about that, but it seems like because this is a rather large school of thought. We haven't invented this. The ideas of unschooling and self-directed learning have become in vogue again now, but there was a big movement towards this in the 60s and 70s, pioneered by people like John Holt, that really took on pretty wide adoption. And so I have to believe that if you're a PhD in education, if the system is working properly, you'll have encountered these ideas. But for whatever reason, they weren't mentioned. And so we were like, yeah, we'll start a school and we can do that. At least I was feeling that way. But as we looked into it more and more, the red tape was so intense. And while there have been people that have pulled it off, starting schools in a self-directed learning fashion, and many more now than there were at the time, that felt a little bit too burdensome. But we did see this camp opportunity as a way to create kind of a microcosm of these ideas, right? A testing ground to see, well, what happens at scale? We want to do this in our own family, but does it work? What if we have 100 kids together at the same time, largely doing whatever they want all day? Is that going to cause problems? Is it going to cause conflict? Is it going to cause a lack of motivation? Like, we had a lot of questions, I think, at the time, and things we wanted to answer. So yeah, moving up to camp, I think, scratched both of those itches. It was an opportunity to create a self-directed learning environment, a living environment, I guess is a better way to put it, and also to give our kids that in the truest form at home. Yeah.
And I think there's one more piece of it, which is more of the parenting side and just the family relationship side. And this might be really helpful for people who have, babies and younger children to hear. I think as a mother, what I was finding is that my instinct and the way that my instinct was telling me to be a mother to my baby was really hard to listen to in the life that we were living. So, I had 5 months off from work when he was first born, and I spent so much of that time trying to figure out how to get him to take naps on his own, because I knew that he was going to go to daycare and have to take a nap. And I was so nervous about how that would go if I didn't get him to the place where he could do that on his own. So this kind of mainstream life that we were living was also really chipping away at my ability to listen to my instinct and to raise my baby the way that felt right to me. And I actually, made some choices in my parenting of him in that first year that I really regret and wish I hadn't made, because I felt all this pressure to get him to fit the box so that he would be okay in the box. And I think he was making it really clear that just wasn't going to work for him. And James and I have talked about how grateful we are that he has always been such a strong-willed person, even from the time he was a baby, because he just wasn't having it. And he was making it really clear, even when he did end up going to daycare, he was miserable. And he was making it really clear to us, he was telling us, Mom and Dad, I don't like this. I want to be at home with you. And I think that it finally hit a point, these are all layers, the self-directed education, what we saw in that Sir Ken Robinson talk, and then just our baby. If you talk about self-directed, he was telling us this is not working. And so that move to sell our home and move out of New Jersey and move to New York where I could be home was as much about listening to him finally and being able to create space in our lives for us to follow his lead and listen to him.
Yeah, I think it comes down to stories that you tell yourself. And I think early on in parenting, I was telling myself a story that I think is really supported by popular culture, which is, sure, you're going to have this baby, but don't let that change your life.
Yeah.
Don't let this take away from all those things you love to do, like watching baseball games at nighttime or going out or getting a good night's sleep or sleeping alone in bed with your wife or whatever, right? And you hear all these messages that if you sacrifice those things, you're somehow losing or you're somehow not being true to yourself. And even when your instincts tell you, I should give more to this fragile little person. I should give of myself in a way that perhaps stretches me. everyone basically in your life will tell you things like, hey, it's okay. You don't need to do that. Just, like things we tried with helping Ollie to go to sleep at night,
It's probably a whole episode.
Yeah. Terrifying and embarrassing actually to admit now, but like, trying to be like, put him back down in the crib. Oh, he's going to cry a little bit. That's okay. He'll get used to it eventually.
And it's for his own good was the message that we were hearing, and maybe also the story we were telling ourselves.
Right. Exactly. Do you want him to be like helpless someday? And then you think about it. And I think we thought about it. And I think one of the things that was really compelling to me was thinking about our evolutionary roots, thinking about how human beings have been on this planet for some couple billion years or whatever, million years. I don't know how long, a couple million years. A billion would be before dinosaurs. So that would be factually inaccurate, as they say. But humans have been on the earth for a couple million years. And throughout almost all of that time, like if all of human time were on a clock from noon to midnight, the last minute or so, people would be parenting mostly the way they do now, right? Schools themselves.
In our society, yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's true. Schools themselves were only really popularized in the 1800s. And so this move away from trying to attend to and parent your own child is really a modern phenomenon. And I think one that people are rightfully questioning now. And all these little aspects, like where the kid sleeps, which again, I think it probably is a pretty good episode at some point, because we have, I don't know, I guess unusual compared to a lot of people's sleeping arrangements in our house, even now, to how kids spend their days, how parents should be expected to spend their days, what it means to be an empowered woman, for instance. I think, it's a long discussions have been had in our family and elsewhere about, is it selling out as a woman, for instance, to go home and just be with your kids, just be with your kids, know? Or as a man, when we were leaving camp, spoiler alert, we did eventually leave that job. I remember someone said to me when they heard my goal was to work at home, but then to parent half time, this guy, a really powerful, strong-willed person said, "Oh, you're going to need more than that at some point
in your life." You mean?
Yeah. You're going to need more than just working half time and parenting the rest of the time, right? So, a long story short is there are all these factors that I think pressure you away from self-directed education, and it's easy to listen to them because all of them point you in a direction of something that in the short term seems easier. It's like, I don't have to have my kids around all day. Like they can be off being taken care of by other people. Like that sounds like a sweeter deal, But I think as we looked at it more and more, we just didn't feel like that was going to be as good a deal as proposed. And that kind of sums up my feelings on it. Next part of the story is, so we were at camp for a few years. We did see a lot of really beautiful things happen in the self-directed learning environment at camp. That opened up a ton of really cool new opportunities for us. Drop my phone so you get to listen to that. Opened up a ton of new professional opportunities for me as people in the camping industry started to see the power of self-direction, because, that camp went from really financially struggling to meet its enrollment goals. And I think it's qualitative, just delivering a good time goals, to being a place that was really thriving on all cylinders, I believe. And that became really cool because I think we started thinking about these ideas even more intentionally and tried to go even deeper on what it means. Because when you start going down this self-directed rabbit hole, you have to ask yourself a lot of questions, right? Because I think it's easy, once again, to pat oneself on the back and say, hey, I let my kid be a little bit more self-directed in this area. Go me. I'm doing this great job that most people aren't doing. But alongside of that comes, well, what about these other areas? What about the area that we live? What about, how they spend their time, even if it's in ways that aren't comfortable for me, So, and that's, I think, what we hope to talk about a lot in this podcast. But one of the things that wasn't really meeting our needs out there was community. I think we found some cool people, but the issue was we were like half an hour from the grocery store we like to shop at, right? So we were really remote.
And half an hour from most of the people that we had found too.
Like
half
like
an hour to 45 minutes. Yeah.
And I think that became really difficult because while we were living on a beautiful property, 800 acres at a 45-acre lake. And, some of our best friends were living right next door to us, managing the facility and helping out with cooking. It was still not quite right. So
I think we felt like, at this time too, we had our second child. They're 2 years apart. And I was driving a lot during the week to get them to just, different things that we wanted to do during our days. And I think we just really started to think, if we stay here, there's going to be so much traveling all the time in order for our kids to have community and for us to have a sense of community. And that sort of traveling was just not so appealing to us.
Yeah, for sure. And I think so then we started getting our mind turning And like, what were we going to do about this? Because it's not the easiest thing when you start asking yourself the question, well, where are there other people who are doing self-directed learning to the degree that we like, you know? One of the things that we had looked into many, many years before that was this thing called the Free State Project, which is basically a migratory movement to New Hampshire of people that believe in self-direction in all forms. And there was a community out here that we had the sense that there was a community around the parenting stuff out here. I don't think we knew quite the degree to which it was possible for it to happen. But that was on our radar. We also even looked at things like Sudbury schools. You know, Sudbury schools, for those of you who don't know, are democratic free schools where kids spend their days doing what they want. And then all the community standards are developed via these school meetings, you know, where kids and faculty have the same level of say. And this was really attractive to us. We had met and invited up to camp the Hudson Valley Sudbury School, phenomenal people there, really, really inspirational community of kids being self-directed and forming community in a way that I hadn't observed in any other schooling environment. But then we started asking ourselves the question, well, what if our kids don't want to go to the self-directed learning school that we find for them?
Right.
And that was a tricky one for us to reconcile. And so I think we looked into more seriously this idea of moving out to New Hampshire and being a part of the community out here, which we did eventually decide. But this was kind of scary too, because poker was no longer a viable thing. We were working at the camp, and that was very good for our financial security, and that we didn't have more expenses than we had revenues.
Right, because our housing was covered.
But we weren't making any money. Like,
right.
You know, we were finishing the year with like a couple $100 more than we had the prior year. So we didn't have like a huge runway of savings to burn through from prior times in our lives. And so we started looking into, and I don't know if we'll ever get into this. I don't know if this is really a peaceful parenting or parenting sort of topic, but we started looking into becoming self-employed, you know.
I think that falls under the One Free Family umbrella, right?
Yeah.
How to make changes so that your family can have more freedom.
Yeah, but you're right. I think that, actually, I was listening to a podcast called The Voluntary Life with Jake DeSillis, who has since become a friend because he came out to visit New Hampshire and wants to move here. We miss you too, Jake. Hope to see you soon. But in listening to his podcast, it was all about, you know, finding true freedom in your own life was about not having to be financially bound to especially jobs that require you to show up at a certain place at a certain time in exchange for money in the long term. So we started really looking into how we could make it work. So maybe we could split time. You know, I think that was the original conception. We would each work around like 20 hours a week and then parent the other 20 hours a week. And we would sort of see which projects were working the best financially, kind of prioritize those to the degree that it was necessary and go from there.
Right.
So I started a couple different businesses at the time. One was in that summer camp consulting and continuing education space, doing a bit of public speaking in that regard as well. And then another business with my friend Doug that had to do with statistical modeling and fantasy sports. So two totally different avenues, but, you know, two different lottery tickets, I guess, you know, to try to figure out the DFS or daily fantasy sports industry was kind of burgeoning at the time. And the summer camp thing was the thing I knew best. So I figured between the two of those, I could make something work.
Yeah. And I, in the time that we had been in New York, I had trained and certified to become a birth doula.
What's that?
Which I was going to say, if you don't know what that is essentially a companion for a family when they're going through kind of the childbearing year and pregnancy and birth and postpartum. So it's non-medical support, but it's emotional and physical support during their labor and birth, and then helping them transition into parenthood.
We made those bets, and, you know, we had some other, I guess, investments and things as side options of ways to make income for the future. And just the cliff notes on this is that it did work out. We were able to figure out how to make it work and continue to not work too much and to be around and available for our kids. And that has been life-changing. And I think maybe we'll get more deeply into how that all works or how it's looked for us, but would highly recommend just taking a shot, because the way it ultimately worked was I was working at camp full-time and working on these businesses at nighttime. And I think we made a lot of big time family sacrifices there, mostly in terms of time you and I could have been spending hanging out, which felt like a pretty big sacrifice. Obviously, we really enjoy hanging out. We've known each other for quite some time and we're besties, and we like doing all the things that people like to do. Mostly I'm talking about like watching Netflix and chatting and whatever, moving on. But it was a big investment of time and energy and, you know, potentially money, or at least opportunity costs, in terms of looking for a different job or whatever. But it has worked out really, really well.
And I think even just, you know, myself, after spending a whole day with a 2 and a 4-year-old, which is really fulfilling in so many ways, it's also really exhausting. Then they're asleep and you sit down to turn your brain back on and do some work because, we moved here and I had to rebuild my whole doula business because nobody knew me here.
Yeah, right.
So I think it can feel really overwhelming to think about making this big change, but we did do a couple big things. We made 2 huge geographic moves, but all of the other stuff, it was just like one step at a time. It was like, I'm going to sit down and work on this tonight, and I'm going to work on it for a few nights this week. And it was really just putting one foot in front of the other and having this goal down the road of where we wanted to be. And I know people here where we live now, friends of ours who are kind of in that phase right now. Like they're wanting to have more freedom in their schedules, and they have this goal and they know that it's like one thing at a time that they're doing to kind of get there.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote I heard when I was getting into online business, because I think it applies to parenting, especially improving as a parent, which I think hopefully a lot of what this podcast will be about is our journey to continue to try to improve at parenting. And what he said was, if you don't start now, all you're doing is delaying your good years. That there's going to be hard work that you have to invest up front, and you're going to have to put in serious time, and you're going to have to do it when you're not very good at it yet. And in the case of business, when you're not making any money yet, or in the case of parenting, when it feels really scary. But if you put the time in and you look at it intentionally and you practice smarter instead of harder and all those sorts of things, that you will land on those good years eventually. And I think hopefully, I feel like we're in a good years phase right now, both in terms of the businesses, but also in terms of parenting. But that doesn't mean that there isn't more improvement to be had.
Sure. And I think even in the process of making all these changes in our lives, I think it can be easy to get caught in a place where maybe I'm having kind of a tense interaction with one of my kids and thinking in my head, I can tell myself a story sometimes of like, well, you're just really frustrated right now. You'll wake up tomorrow and do better.
Yeah.
But for me, it's been more about saying, well, actually, maybe I can just change what I'm doing right this second. It doesn't have to be like an all or nothing thing like, well, this day is ruined, but tomorrow will be better. And that's been I think that kind of is a parallel to what you're saying about the business side of that. The parenting side is just like, well, actually, even if I'm not the parent I want to be yet, in this moment, I can make a better choice. And that's been really, really powerful for me. And it's something that I still have to remind myself of often.
Yeah, I think it's actually an indicator when we hit a moment of frustration, like a way we've talked about it, and that's been helpful for us in terms of trying to be a work in progress, trying to aspire to continue to be better, is like when you hit one of those moments. I had one of these yesterday, as a matter of fact, that you're like, wow, I was really unprepared for this moment, right? Because that's where I think those deep emotional reactions come from, whether it's anger or sadness or frustration or fear, I was really unprepared for this moment. What led me to not anticipate that this might happen and to have no kind of methodology or approach to interacting with this in a way that I would be proud of.
Right.
And I think that is an empowering mindset, because when you're in the place of saying things like, well, I just have kind of a bad temper,
right,
or I just get frustrated pretty easily, or these types of things frustrate me, then you're telling yourself a story that, so this happened, that was okay. And if it happens again, I will react in the same way, and that will be okay. This is just
what happens to me.
Yeah, you're making space for yourself to have that reaction in the future. And a slight modification for that, I think, is a very empowering one, which is, okay, this happened. I reacted a certain way. That was okay. And I can try and improve and be better next time, because there are little things. Like for me, one of my huge triggers early on was not getting enough sleep. Like when I was on a totally self-directed schedule of staying up very late, waking up very late, and having this little baby show up who he woke up a ton. Like that was one of the biggest challenges. And we were putting him in a crib 2 rooms away from us, which also I think added to the challenge. But he woke up and it would take him half an hour or 40 minutes to go to bed. And this made me angry. It didn't I didn't feel compassion for him I know it's terrible now, just being honest.
Yeah.
I didn't feel compassion for him. I didn't put myself in his shoes. I felt resentful. I felt like I need my sleep.
Yeah.
That was the story I told myself. The most important thing here is that I get my sleep. So how can I expedite this process of putting this baby back in this crib so I can go sleep again? And that was a failing plan. I wasn't.
That was not going to work.
I was telling myself, I don't think I even thought about my reaction or owned my role in that engagement at all. It was mostly like, I just need to get back to sleep. Like, what the hell's going on here? And that didn't, spoiler alert again, didn't change anything for the better. All it did was continue to build my resentment over time. And sure, I imagine whatever we did, he would have figured out sleeping eventually, just because most people do. You don't have a lot of 25-year-olds waking up in the night crying and needing their moms to hug them or whatever. But I think I delayed the process of myself engaging peacefully and nicely and effectively. And I delayed the process of him feeling comfortable because I refused to say, okay, I reacted this way. Could I react in a different way in the future? And how would that be better?
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that will be an ongoing theme as we record more and more of these, because I think when people first encountering, and I'll tell you what the theme is in a second, that's called a teaser. I think when people first hear ideas like this, the reaction of many people is to look inwardly and acknowledge, probably rightfully, that there are going to be things that we say or that we believe are kind of best practices in parenting or the ways we want to parent that you as a listener don't, right? There are going to be things that we try to do now that you currently or in the past haven't thought are a good idea. And all I want to say is everything that we're going to talk about in this podcast are things that we didn't always believe, especially as people who worked with kids a ton in a summer camping environment. Originally, we first met at a summer camp.
Yeah, from the time we were teenagers. We were camp counselors.
Exactly. And we interacted with kids in ways that are polar opposites of how we interact with kids now. I, in particular, I was loving, but I was, pretty authoritarian. I was, okay with punitive discipline and all these different things that I no longer believe are a good idea. And I think it harkens back to an inspirational quote from this woman, Lorelei, who was one of my mentors at Johnsonburg, which is the camp where we grew up, where she said, you can't beat yourself up based on learning something new that you didn't always believe. You have to just try to seek truth and embrace it as it comes to be known. And I think that's the empowering piece for me. So anything that we say, understand that we didn't always do this. So we don't think we're better than anyone, I guess is the main point. And if you don't believe or don't do the things that we currently do, that doesn't make you worse. That means you think something different. And you might have empirical evidence or just evidence or a gut feeling that what something we say is not right for you and your family. Yeah. And that's totally okay too. This podcast is not about how to become the best parent possible based on the stats. This is about how we're trying to parent better, the parents that we're aspiring to be. And hopefully we can, inspire people who want to be better parents to adopt a similar mindset, because it's not about the specific tactics. I think it's about how you approach parenting. And then beyond that, try to incorporate what sounds like it might work for you and what might make a better and more effective and more peaceful environment for you and your home, right? So please never listen to anything we say as judgment. Even I can tell you, even in our backroom conversations, when we're privately sitting together at nighttime when no one else can hear, we don't try to judge other parents. We simply talk about what's working for us. And I mean, we might take inspiration from things we've seen elsewhere to start conversations or something, but it's not about who's a good parent, who's a bad parent. Right. It's about how we can all be on this really tough journey together and become the best parents possible.
Yeah. And I think a piece of that too is just recognizing and accepting that making some of these changes can feel really scary. Yeah. And that's okay too. I think that something that is an ongoing process for me is learning to live in that place of like, this feels a little bit scary, but learning to accept that and knowing that that's part of the process of change and growth as well. So I think it's, always important to continually check in with yourself about, okay, I heard this idea and I'm not sure about it. And then to really take that time to sit with it and say, is it because my instinct is telling me this just isn't right for me? Or is it because it maybe is right and it feels scary? And the answer will be different each time for each person and with each idea. But I think sifting through that and understanding that some things might just feel scary for a while, and that's okay too. And a lot of the things that have scared me in the past about changes we have made, for me now feel like the best changes we could have made. At the same time, there are still things that we're kind of practicing that still feel really scary to me, but logically they feel right. So we keep working on them.
Yeah, I think a helpful practice in this regard is to, it's almost a meditative practice, but acknowledge the feelings as they come in when you hear new ideas. This is what I continue to try to do because my paradigms in terms of how I interact with kids change on an ongoing basis every week pretty much. But acknowledge the feelings as they come in and honor them. They're coming from some place that feels important to you. And you don't want to tell yourself a story that you're not good enough because you can't embrace these ideas right away or something. But then once you acknowledge that they're there for valid reasons, try to figure out why. One of the main impulses that I had originally was feeling guilty. When I would hear a new idea on how to interact with kids differently, I would feel guilty because I knew in my heart that I had interacted with kids in a different way in the past. And I think specifically about failures I had in connecting with kids in the camping environment. I'm thinking of this one kid, Stewie, for instance. It still sticks with me in my first ever counseling unit, who I just went head to head with all the time. Like he was a really troubled kid. He was having trouble interacting, but most of what he was having trouble with was not really wanting to do the things that we were offering at camp.
Right.
And I did so many things I would never dream of doing now. Look me in the eye when you're talking to me type stuff, like stuff that I would never aspire to be as a parent or as someone who interacts with young people. And it was a complete and utter failure. This kid had a terrible time at camp, ultimately got in a fist fight with another camper, I think because he was so tense based on his interactions with me, and left camp and never came back, right? And so this was an interaction that was a colossal failure. And when he left, nobody told me the story that I had any role in the engagement. It was all about, he was just obstinate. He didn't want to, of course, what else were you supposed to do? He didn't want to go to nature, or he didn't want to go to the arts and crafts center, And it's like, okay, at the time, I guess that was what I needed to hear as a 17-year-old trying to make my way in the world. But as a grown-up who's going to have your own kid, I didn't want to choose to continue to make what I believe to be the same mistakes just because I had made them at one time, And so overcoming that sense of guilt that I may have done the wrong thing and it may have had a bad impact on someone's life. Right. That was hard for me. I mean, because I really do care about these kids that I've worked with at camp. I really do obviously care about my own kids, and acknowledging, I think it's even harder, frankly, when it's your own kids, but acknowledging I used to do this thing, send Ollie to daycare against his very obvious will. Yeah. And now I wouldn't do that. And I just love him so much. And I would never want to do something that I think is the wrong thing, but acknowledging that I did something that I don't want to do is the way to stop it in the future. And if you really care, for me, if I really care, I can overcome those feelings and work on my own crap on my own time. And in the meantime, it's too important to find the right ideas to just sit with old ideas because that's more comfortable,
Yeah, I think you're kind of saying something that has become a big idea in my life. And it's come up in many different areas of my life, but is the idea of so I interacted with this kid in this way, and I would do it differently. So there's two things going on there, which James has talked about, is there's that feeling of guilt and just feeling terrible that you did that. And then there's also that need to do better. So you're talking about something that has become a big idea for me, which is when we interact with somebody, and for the sake of this podcast, a child, in a way that we wish we hadn't, I think that there's kind of two ways we could react, right? We could react by feeling really guilty and getting down on ourselves about it and wanting to do better. Or we could react by kind of telling ourselves a story that that's what needed to happen. But for me, there's actually a third way. And that's what's become a big part of my life now, is that you can actually have both of those things at the same time. And I think being able to hold both of those things at the same time, right? So I feel really badly and really guilty that I did this, and I really, really want to do better. So I'm acknowledging that. I'm letting myself feel those feelings, and I'm willing to improve. But at the same time, I'm also, being gentle with myself and telling myself, I'm going to show myself compassion for that. And I'm going to move on and do better next time. So I'm not just showing myself compassion and telling myself a story that that's what I needed to do, and I'm just going to keep doing the same thing. But I'm also not just saying, you're such a bad person, you need to do better. Because then, if I can't be gentle with myself, how can I be gentle with my children?
Yeah. I think that's a really powerful point, because the reality is that every parent in the moment that they're dealing with something is doing their best, right? No one's has bad intentions. I'm going to mess this kid up now. Right. I see an opportunity to screw him up for life. No one's saying that. Everyone is presented with a stimulus, basically, of a kid acting in a certain way or saying a certain thing, or his life or her life going in a different direction. And then we react based on the sum of our experiences and our genetics and whatever else. And then we have this opportunity for reflection after the fact. But reflecting back, those guilty feelings I was talking about, doesn't really accomplish anything. It kind of feels cathartic a little bit, because you're you tell yourself that you should feel bad. So feeling bad feels like doing something. Feeling bad is not doing anything. It's just beating yourself up and probably making you worse in the future, right? Because maybe it's going to paralyze you. Maybe it's going to cause you fear. And that doesn't really help. So I think that's actually really good groundwork to lay for the future of this podcast. Yeah. That if you're going to come along with us and hear about our story and hear about what we aspire to be as parents, understand that as you're coming along this with us, we're all going to be works in progress here. We're all going to be trying to aspire to be better. And none of us, it's not going to be helpful if we sit around judging anyone who does things differently than we are, or responds to stimulus in ways that we don't, or just holds different ideas. I mean, I think there are some things that are objectively better and worse, and perhaps we'll get to those at some point.
Yeah.
But by and large, there's seas of grays, and there's, these different points along the journey that we're all going to be along. And the helpful way to approach all this, I think, is to come at this from a self-directed learning perspective.
Exactly, with a learner's mind.
Exactly. A beginner's mind, another Buddhist idea. The idea that we can approach all these things fresh. If we had just shown up on Earth for the first time and we encountered this idea, what would we think would be the best way to handle it? And I think if we figure out what our target is, then we can actually aim at it. And hopefully that will be our goals in this podcast.
And I fully expect even, if this podcast goes on for a long time, which I hope it does, that we might be sitting here a year from now and telling you, we've changed our minds on this one thing that we talked about 100%. In episode 4 or whatever. So, that happens to James and I all the time. We're always changing our minds and coming up with new ideas about how we want to interact with our children and how we want to live our lives and even interact with one another. So, just more to say that we are works in progress right along with you.
100%. So where are we right now as we move into episodes 2 and beyond? Right now, we're up to 3 kids total.
3 of them.
Ali, Ezra, and August. And they are right now 7, 5, and 1.5, almost 2, if you can believe it.
Yeah.
Listeners out there. And we are, I guess we haven't really pinned down what our days look like. So let's talk about that.
That could almost be a whole episode, but we could give a quick
I'll give a quick overview.
Yeah.
The way our days look like is we wake up and everyone does what they want all day. That's the clip
for
notes.
the most part. With some negotiation and give and take.
For sure. Yeah, there's definitely some nuance, especially given that parenting time is scarce and we can't responsibly leave our kids home alone or anything like that. There is a lot of negotiation that does get involved, but our goal is that people in our family will be spending time doing things that they're intrinsically motivated to do as much as possible, understanding that sometimes the family goes to Mexico, even if one person says, I don't think I want to go. We don't cancel the whole vacation, right? So, but that's what we aspire to, a day where everyone feels like they were motivated to do the things that they were doing. And where we hope to be, I think in the future, or the reason we do that, the major goals that we have for that is that we hope to raise kids who get used to using freedom, who use the freedom that they have to pursue the things that they're motivated to pursue. And we think that practicing that as early and often as possible will help them to become more in tune with their own
to
inner
know
voice.
themselves. Yeah, that's so huge.
Yeah, for sure. And to become in tune with what their goals are in the world, who they want to be. And the ongoing work that we're going to have to continue to do is divorce ourselves from how we pictured their lives might go, or living vicariously through them to pursue things that are important to us. And that, I think, is the ongoing challenge that we're facing. But yeah, I think that's a pretty decent 50,000 foot summary of our approach to life and how our days look. And we'll get into all that nitty gritty stuff as the podcast continues on. But I'm pretty excited. I think
Me too.
It's been a long time. I mean, I think we talked about doing something like this many years ago when I think we only had Ali as a 2-year-old, right? And I think now with a few more years of experience under our belt
and more children
and more children on the old belt are in there too. In your case, literally under your belt at one point, and now out into the world. What are you saying? Okay, that's not awkward.
No, it's
They
true.
were in your stomach.
They were there.
Yeah, you're not really a belt person though.
No, I don't wear belts much.
Especially not when pregnant. But
no, that'd be uncomfortable.
Belts and pregnancy don't mix. That's your first lesson for today's podcast. But as we go forward, we do think we have some things to lend to this kind of movement of self-directed learners, some insights we picked up along the way in terms of our camping work and our work in our community out here in New Hampshire. And hopefully little fun stories and things like that will lighten your mood a bit too. So if you're the type of person, if you're out there, any point along this journey, we really hope you'll come along. If you have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old yourself and you're not sure how you're going to wind up or what sort of educational approach you're going to wind up with, this podcast totally is for you. If you're farther along the unschooling or self-directed learning approach, I think you'll have a lot to get out of this. And if you just want to find personal moments of growth in your parenting in the most traditional way possible or whatever, I think that hopefully we'll have something for everybody. But yeah, self-directed learning is going to be a major theme. So if that's something you're interested in, we hope you'll tune in the future.
This has been fun.
Say goodbye, dude.
Goodbye.
We're not quite professionals yet, so we'll just end it with this. The end.
Thank you for listening to One Free Family. If you enjoy the podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron at onefreefamily.com/support. Your support will help make this show better. Plus, you can get access to rewards and additional episodes by joining. Again, that's onefreefamily.com/support. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.